Well, good morning to everyone. And I was just thinking there are so many other things you could have done on a wet Thursday morning. So I'm glad you're all here. I'm really excited to meet and hear from several of you. We've had some conversations last night and this morning, and I can see a lot of energetic platform activity already happening with several of you and your companies. But Anand gave me the charge of getting you all excited about platforms in the morning, so that's what I'm going to try to do. I like to be very interactive, so we'll, if necessary, we can do that within the 40 minutes I have now, but that's certainly the rest of the day. I would love to interact and speak with several of you, so we'll look out for opportunities to do that. The first thing I want to do in terms of getting you excited is actually see how many of you actually were part of the platform economy right today or this evening, right? Or last evening. So if, yes, question or you are? You are, absolutely, yes. How did you get here? Many of you, did anyone take a taxi? You did, all right, a few. Did any of you take a Lyft or an Uber or had Scoop there? That's the big shift in the economy already. And what's fascinating about that, really think about it. So you used a Lyft or an Uber, and we're going to discuss that as a type of platform. It's unlike those of you who took a taxi company, with fixed assets and a fleet and schedule, they deployed those fixed assets to create some service, some value to you as the customer. And a Lyft doesn't do that. They enable, they coordinate. So that's something we're going to talk about, platforms and ecosystems. But it's really more interesting than that, because you call the Lyft using your smartphone, which is yet another platform, right? And this is a platform where Lyft actually assigned the driver to you. You didn't have a choice. But with the smartphone platform, you actually picked a dozen or 50 apps to add to this phone that somebody sold you, right? It's a very different kind of platform. And then, the Lyft enabled you to find a driver that they coordinated with you. And then you took the ride, and then you paid with your credit card or some other payment mechanism. And typically, that's another platform. And that's a much long-standing platform. And it took several decades for the entire platform architecture and ecosystem to come about in the case of credit cards. But you see these three very different sorts of platforms that you interacted with if you took a ride with someone to come here. If you happen to drive, did anyone drive? And you may have used Google Maps or better still, Waze. And now this is a really interesting kind of platform, because this is where what we call demand-side economies of scale and network effects kick in. So what's interesting about Waze is that the information signals you're getting about traffic come from people like you, right? And in fact, as you use Waze as a consumer, you're a producer at the same time. You're sending information signals about traffic, and if you're actually a little more socially active, if you see a pothole or a stopped car or a police vehicle, you're going to provide additional signals more actively rather than passively, all right? So these two examples cover some really interesting facets of what the platform architecture to business is all about, and something that we're seeing extensively in the last several years. So I'm not going to try to define platforms, but I think in many industries, manufacturing, automobiles, software in particular, we use the term platform in very different ways. So I think it's useful to understand the perspective that we all want to adopt when we think about platforms. And the idea is that with platforms, we're thinking about businesses that deliver value in ways that are fundamentally different than what traditional businesses did. And in particular, what platforms do, as you saw in the last couple of examples, is they create value by leveraging a really large ecosystem of external players. And these players can be called developers, communities of users, and so forth, depending on the context. But the idea is that these platforms really, rather than hold extremely expensive fixed assets or have long-term commitments and rigid contracts between participants, they do all of this very fluidly, leveraging the power of network effects, as we saw with Waze, ecosystems, as we saw in the other examples, and really software. Anand talked about software, IT, analytics, mobile, all of these technologies that we have really come to love in the last several decades. And platforms are all over the place. We've been interacting with them in many ways for several years now. And what is interesting about platforms and ecosystems is really both quantitative and qualitative. And that's something I'd like to share with you, that sort of source of excitement, that you can think of the importance of platforms and ecosystems in terms of quantity, scale, profits, and so forth. And that's great, and I'll show you a few things. But really, where it gets really, really interesting is when you think of it in terms of qualitative, in terms of how it is changing the way we think of a business and how a business interacts with its partners and supplies value. All right, so we'll talk about these two things. So let's look first in a quantitative sense. And this is such an interesting story about platforms, business models that has happened in the last several years. So if you look back just 10 years ago and see what were the top 5 firms in terms of market cap: oil and gas, banking, telecom, very traditional firms with expensive fixed assets, long-term relationships, the things I just talked about. And then you fast forward 10 years, I'll just do that quickly. The top 5 firms on market cap are all businesses that derive the bulk of their profits from platform thinking, this enablement, coordination, matching, and other services that platforms perform. And what's really, really interesting about this is the transition from one to the other. So Apple obviously is in a platform industry, and it has been like that. It was true even in the 1980s and 90s. And you might ask, well, what suddenly made Apple become so successful and profitable if they were always practicing a platform strategy? Then what's so unique about now, right? And we all know that in the 1980s and then 90s, Apple was in a platform industry, but with 3 to 5% market share, right? And so in an industry that is severely dependent on network effects for success, having a tiny fraction of the market as a platform player actually hurts you rather than helps you, right? And Apple also made some flawed business strategies in terms of how they partnered with ecosystem providers, the business models they adopted, and so forth. So that's an important aspect of their migration or success story. 2007, of course, the iPhone came about, and Apple also made some smart decisions at the time in terms of migrating its older iPod ecosystem into the iPhone ecosystem by developing the iPod Touch, which was basically an inexpensive iPhone that did everything else except make phone calls. But it gave their developers a massive market to build on because iPods were much more in quantity at the time than iPhone. And so that transformation really enabled Apple to become such a successful company now. Think of Google as this wonderful smart search engine in 2000, 2003, and then the migration to advertising as part of the business model, and then building a platform that would, and really an ecosystem that brought advertisers, shoppers, analytics providers, media placement companies, and so forth into this ecosystem is part of the success. Facebook was just a social network for friends, but now it's a platform for shopping, news, fake news, if you will. So that's something really, really interesting about why these companies are becoming so successful and leading in their industries today. And Amazon is a similar story. It was just an online bookstore, right? And then music and so forth. But the transformation to a marketplace using platform thinking is really what catalyzed the growth of Amazon. So that's just, so that's profit, that's market value. Markets are often wrong, and we discovered that several years later. But the other way to think about it is really understanding and consumer brand value. And there, if you look at what fraction of value is coming out of a brand that is based on platform thinking, there again, the story is similar. It's not 100%, like I showed you in the top 5 out of 5. But platform thinking is really pervasive even as you go beyond the top 5 or 10 companies. And you find a mix. There are companies like Honda and H&M or JP Morgan, Pampers that are not platform companies. But then you still see platforms distributed throughout from the top to the bottom. Peter Evans, who was at the Center for Global Enterprise for the last few years, did this study about looking at where is platform activity happening? Where's the innovation? Where's the thinking? And this is a really nice visual that sort of confirms the leadership of the US in platform thinking. But you can see that platforms are being really created all across the globe, with China, India, Germany, London being other leading players. But what was interesting about this study was that they actually went out and hired researchers in all parts of the world. And they basically counted 192 companies that could be thought of as platform firms and had over $1 billion in revenue, right? So that's an interesting evidence of the scale of platforms. I've been teaching an MBA course on platforms for about 12, 13 years. And at that point, talking about network effects and platforms was such, it was an exotic thing. And my point here is to say that platforms are no longer exotic. They really become mainstream aspects of business thinking. So let's really move towards the qualitative aspect of it, right? And this quote and this idea has become really popular in discussions about platforms, that many of these very, very visible successful platform companies have really revolutionized the way they have created those businesses, right? So, Airbnb now, the largest provider of hotel rooms by far, or rooms by far, doesn't really own rooms, right? And they have built those 4 million listings in less than 10 years compared to, and that sort of, I think, exceeds the top 3 hotel chains combined that have invested hundreds of billions of dollars over decades to get that far. So that's evidence, again, of something. It's not just numbers, right? And at this point, something interesting is happening. And so I just want to give you my perspective on what is something interesting that is happening and which is enabling this kind of really disruptive, transformative change. And when I think about all the pieces of this puzzle, and you really sit back on a recliner and think about it deep and hard, my view is that what we're seeing in platform thinking, what we call the platform revolution, is really as big as the industrial revolutions were 100, 200 years ago. And the way I would frame it to you is that if you look at the architectures of most businesses that we have seen during the last 200 years, those architectures really grew out of the technologies that came out in the 2 industrial revolutions. And these are heavy machinery, fast transportation, steam engines, a lot of automation, mechanical automation. And what that did for business was it really made sense to create businesses that have massive supply-side economies of scale and scope. So you get big, and then you do a lot of activity at one place. You do it with machines, and then maybe you ship something because with cheap and fast transportation, then you send raw materials or finished goods and so forth. And you build this pipeline that conveys value from upstream to downstream, and then money flows the other way around, right? That's been the architecture on which all the industries and businesses we have seen in the last couple of 100 years have been founded. What that really means from a business perspective, and I'll just abstract and simplify and just take one lens, like an operations lens, is, as I said, what it creates is that a role of a business is to think in terms of inputs, process, and outputs. And then ultimately, something is delivered to consumers through some kind of linear supply chain, right? So I come from UC Davis. We are very, very well known for wine education. So the production, distribution, ultimate delivery of wine sort of occurs in a linear supply chain, and with goods and value, money flowing in these 2 directions. What that does is, with all the heavy machinery, automation, and so forth, it really gives you a pretty predictable supply. Machines produce 10,000 widgets a day, and they'll do it day in and day out, and occasionally there's maintenance and failures and replacement, but you pretty much get a predictable, smooth supply. Demand doesn't behave like that. Demand is idiosyncratic, volatile, less predictable. And so you have the situation where smooth, certain demand supply is facing very unpredictable demand. And so over several decades, we've had Band-Aids, right? We've worked on several innovations, just-in-time inventory, switching from make to stock to make to order, other innovations and operations, marketing, learning customer preferences better so you can produce the right things. But all of those are really band-aiding the situation, and you still have this volatile demand to which you try to balance supply and make it match. And of course, making supply non-smooth is very expensive for most traditional companies because they have these expensive fixed assets, long-term contracts, commitments that they have to fulfill. And so that's really a tension in how the traditional businesses have worked for all these years. But what did we get just in the last decade, right? We, of course, have phones everywhere, connectivity, and anytime, anywhere communications and computation. I mean, our phones are as powerful as our desktop computers were just a couple of decades ago. And moreover, the transformation has been to what we call smartphones, these platform-driven phones that, using cloud computing, really give you the power of any level of computing you would wish to have. And so these are the consumers every business is facing now, right? Consumers that are connected, able to compute. They have AI agents. And I was speaking with some folks in the insurance world. Think about that now, and that you really have the power to reach consumers and interact with them in very different ways. We got reputation and rating systems, right? Starting with eBay, actually. And then these have been developed and refined and improved over several years. And what that really means is that now a business or a consumer or some business partner is willing to deal with strangers in a way that they could not have done 30 years ago, right? And you, despite never having a relationship or knowledge of the stranger, you begin to understand and trust and be willing to trade with them, right? We have the Internet of Things, right? So there's this really connected devices that are capable in various ways to compute, to move data around. So my point is that if you were to rebuild your business today, right? And if you were not constrained by the architecture that was put together 50 or 100 or 150 years ago, would you build your business the same way? Right? And of course not. And that is what the Ubers and the Airbnbs have done. They have really leveraged these technologies. A Lyft or an Uber couldn't work without reputation systems, right? Or without GPS, mobile, and cell phones. So the idea is that business architecture should respond to the capabilities, economic and technological capabilities of the time. And traditional businesses do not have the luxury of a complete redesign because, and we'll talk about this, there are internal struggles, there are external struggles, there are relationships, there are legacy business models, there's cannibalization. And so the newer thinking is able to avoid many of those constraints. And so if you were to redesign a business today, very often you would say, well, I'm going to organize myself with platform thinking and create an ecosystem of partners that are responsible for managing value, right? So you may have a platform such as Waze or Venmo, where you collect a group of peers, you attract them to this marketplace, and then you give them infrastructure, rules of governance, technologies to enable them to exchange value with each other, right? Or you may create a multi-sided marketplace in which users and developers or buyers and sellers or content creators and content consumers can interact and exchange value and currency and so forth. And the platform, of course, has certain critical roles it needs to perform in order to keep itself viable. So that's one approach to think about, well, where does platform thinking enter into my own business strategy? But of course, as I said, many businesses do not have the luxury of starting from scratch. This is something you can aspire to think about, but it's not necessarily the next step. And so for many other companies, the next step is really going to be somewhat different, which is how to make the best use of platform thinking given the architectures that they already have in place and given the constraints that they have. Now, I also want to have you interact in some way. So I thought, we should talk about the power of ecosystems. And let me just give you a little quiz. So the quote on the left is, as you can see the quote, someone stated very proudly at the time that his software company in 1983 expected to get 50% of its revenues from Macintosh software next year, 1984. Who was that? Bill Gates, right? And this is Microsoft, which became ultimately for several years as the most vicious competitor of Apple. But the point was that even for Microsoft at the time, which was then primarily a software company, it was important to think of the ecosystem that it was playing in and to adopt the right business strategy in this platform world. There's sort of a very interesting related quote, which is in 1997 when Apple was really nearly bankrupt. And I'm sure you can guess who that was. But it's also talk about meaningful partners and an ecosystem and really working in a cooperative relationship with other ecosystem partners that might be competitors. And so who is this speaking and talking about whom? Bill Gates again? That's Steve Jobs talking about Microsoft. When Microsoft bailed out Apple with promising to continue building Microsoft Office and actually released Microsoft Office 1998, which was for Mac, which was better, more advanced than Office for Windows, right? But that really demonstrates the power of ecosystems, which really is talking about a company being willing to engage and share gains with external players outside the company. And that is, of course, very challenging. And what you have to do is try to identify ways in which you're giving, because you cannot get an ecosystem partner, a partner into your ecosystem if they do not get more value out of it than they're putting into it, right? And so if instead of owning 1 million hotel rooms, you're going to allow someone else to make the rooms available to your customers, you've got to share the profits with them, right, for instance. But so this has to be done in a way that the pie itself grows in a multiplicative fashion so that you can give up value. You still have to choose what you control. How do you ensure that you remain part of this ecosystem? You know, you can build a fantastic ecosystem and then be thrown out of it because these partners, these players can engage on their own, right? But ecosystems are really a very, very important driver of platform thinking, right? Continuing to think about it from a qualitative sense. So the numbers are really very obvious, like I showed you before, right? But again, what's so different is, like I described this as a platform revolution. So it's changing fundamentally what a business is all about and what sort of value it provides to customers. So if you go back to just 10 years ago, hailing a taxi, right? Getting a ride in a taxi. What was it really about? What did we think about in terms of our pleasure or pain when we took a taxi ride? And mostly it was about what did it cost me and how was the ride, right? And today when you think about an Uber or a Lyft, we think very differently. It's really about the experience, the driver. Who cared about the driver when you took a taxi, right? But with a Lyft and an Uber, it's a very different experience. And now it's about how quickly you could get the ride. That you punch your button and there's somebody next to you, or you can see exactly where they're coming from. Maybe they offer you water and other courtesies. So it's really changed the nature of the product, right? And again, as I showed with the wine example, that really we had a linear pipeline that supplied value. And what's critical about platforms is that the producer is not the one who controls value or who really offers the product that creates value. It's bringing in all of these external participants, the ecosystem, as part of creating value. So I think a great illustration of this. So think about the mobile telephone industry just 10 years ago, right? And we had cell phones. They had a few features, occasionally a camera, FM radio, maybe some of them had an email, limited internet connectivity. But to get any features on a phone, the power lay in the hands of the phone maker and ultimately with the carrier. And you really had no way to monetize those features outside of the linear relationship from the feature makers to the phone makers to the carrier who ultimately had the revenue arrangement with the customer, right? So this is really a linear flow primarily that I'm trying to depict here. And now notice the change, right? You have the carrier here with the power. It's really in the center of the system and ultimately interacting with the customer. And now that's turned around, right? And it's not to say actually that the customer is now the most critical part, because it's how these other arrows that you cannot see have been rearranged. So it's the smartphone, the operating system platform, and in the case of Apple, the hardware, and in the case of Google, it's Android. It's a smartphone interacting or enabling an ecosystem of hundreds of thousands of developers that are independent value innovators, value creators, but allowing them to interact directly with the customer. And this is really what creates the power of ecosystems, because now you enjoy network effects, right? Customers pick a cell phone or a brand based on the quality and number of apps they can find on the App Store. So when BlackBerry and Nokia and Microsoft really tried really hard 5 years ago to get back into the mobile telephone market, and they came out with great phones, right, the hardware, but that wasn't the point, because now it has become a platform business model where the App Store ecosystem of developers and apps really holds the power. So great product alone is no longer the vital part of successful business, right? And in particular, the powerhouse 10 years ago has been pushed to the side, right? We go to them, this is still a business with very high fixed costs and huge barriers to entry, so there are still only a handful of carriers, so they do have some power because of that. But other than that, they're really irrelevant to our use of a mobile telephone system, right? So that's really the qualitative power of platform thinking to shift the market power of different players in an industry. You might all be thinking about this now and saying, well, is it a threat or an opportunity for me, right? And I think it's a little bit of both, depending on which industry you're in, and it's both whether it's a threat or an opportunity, and what's the timing of getting things done. So here, for example, the picture on the left is the numbers I was telling you earlier about Airbnb versus the hotel industry. And it took a Marriott, as I said, 60 years. 1957 was the first hotel, and then 59 they put something else. And then sort of grew linearly over time, because it's really expensive to add more their acquisitions, which you see that little, I think there's a Starwood acquisition, which is responsible for this bump over here. But overall, 60 years to build about 1.2 million rooms. Even as of 2010, there was a strategic plan to grow the Marriott chain by about, I think, 60,000 rooms, and that would take 5 years to accomplish. Airbnb has been adding 60,000 rooms a month on average, right? So this is a company that started around 2007, but really seriously in 2009, and they have 4 million listings now, okay? So it's clearly a threat to the hotel industry, because now there is this external competitor that has a different product. It's not a hotel room with all the necessary services that go along that. But as you all know, getting competition somewhere along this sequence of products creates external competition for pricing, market power, and so forth within the industry. And I think the example of BlackBerry is another one where its timing was critical, right? So BlackBerry woke up to the idea of platform thinking, but was a little too late. And once you enter the game with a brilliant hardware product, but you've got an app store with 300 or 500,000 apps, and you're struggling to get any external developers into your system, right? Nokia and BlackBerry were really paying developers to write the same apps for their platforms. And there was no benefit for developers in doing so, because you need two sides of the market to make this thing work, and they were out of that market. So timing is critical, right? You want to get into this game before you're shut out of it entirely. And I worked with another really innovative company in the healthcare space, Kairos, which is really fixing an amazing problem that has been ignored for many decades, which is how capacity is allocated inside the healthcare medical system, especially with specialists who work at multiple locations. And the discovery they made was that in Boston, it took people about 6 to 9 months to get an appointment with a specialist, when the specialists themselves were only being utilized about 60%. So there's this 30 to 40% slack or waste that is occurring because of information friction. That there are time slots, and calendars are not integrated, and a patient doesn't really know exactly what kind of specialist they need, so they go through a linear system before they can figure out exactly whom they need, and then the availability and matching just doesn't work. And so they're doing some really interesting things with shared and aggregated calendars, but using machine learning and AI to actually relate to the patient and figure out what kind of specialists they need to talk to, and then, of course, using data about insurance coverages and other details to really match in a much better way. So that's an opportunity to take an industry in which there's so much information friction and use all those modern technologies that we talked about to change the way things are done in the industry. So what can you do? And again, I'd love to talk to you over the day because you're all from very different industries. But we can think about 3 or 4 sort of big ways in which platform thinking can be employed. One is if you're looking at an industry with very deep fragmentation, right? So if I need a handyman to go fix something, or a software developer to write some code or an app, a lot of these things were done previously through word of mouth and other very fragmented arrangements. And you get someone like TaskRabbit or Upwork or Freelancer, which can use technology to create really, really massive scale, which is like what you see with Uber and Lyft, to solve that problem. And so you're going from a deeply fragmented market with no coordination and bringing coordination, matching, discovery, and other features into this system, right? I talked about Kairos and Airbnb, or you could be creating completely new products. So I worked with a colleague who has a really innovative small company that initially began with Bbell, which really began initially with the idea of bringing entertainment events to consumers similarly through shared calendars and so forth. But what they discovered is that once you have the kind of data that you gather in order to provide that service, that is very powerful data. And the ability to analyze and share the data in meaningful ways with ecosystem partners who would really like to have that intelligence is really the source of value, right? So you can create brand new markets. Lending Club, for instance, enables hundreds, thousands of potential investors and bankers to go through a portfolio of loans and choose which ones to fund and so forth. So exactly what you do really will depend on what industry you're in, but there are some important principles about what services platforms might provide, and which ones you provide really depends on your industry and what features, what's the ownership you want in the system. So for instance, an Airbnb enables discovery, but doesn't create matches, right? It's a highly differentiated industry. You want the customer to pick what room they want based on search information that they provide you. A Lyft and an Uber do the matching for you, right? But they also both businesses have to provide a level of trust and follow through the fulfillment process so that these strangers can actually interact with each other and leave with a positive experience. So how do you do it? I think the rest of the day we'll talk about various challenges, and you'll hear case studies, showcases about many of these challenges that arise. I think I was speaking with some people about the internal challenges that if you were to take an existing industry or a business and try to transform this notion of creating an ecosystem, letting go of some critical features and sharing them with business partners, that's really, really hard to do. But there are several other challenges that hopefully we'll discuss some of those today. What I want to do is leave you with a final example. The example, I was trying to pick something that maybe most people are not familiar with. So this is something in healthcare. About 50 to 100,000 children are born in the US every year who have severe hearing problems at birth. So what do you do with them? And one of the controversial solutions that is being practiced today is the practice of having cochlear implants in the ears. And this is as the picture on the top denotes, this is a complicated thing. These devices cost a lot, obviously, so insurance companies and others have to be involved in whether this is the right thing for this child or not. But they also have to be fine-tuned and configured to every child based on their environment, the daycare situation, the characteristics of the child itself. And so there's sort of a linear relationship involving the manufacturer, the insurance company, the physician, technicians who might fine-tune which the device chosen by the physician and paid for by the insurance company. And what these babies do very often is they sometimes want to not have the sound, right? You want quiet, you want to sleep. And so they'll yank out the implants out of their head. And that's really awful, because then you have to go back to the linear supply chain to figure out what to do next and how to reconfigure the new device. And the patients have to go back into the healthcare facility. But what's really happening for the most part is an information process, right? So you can imagine a system like this, where now the customer, the baby at the end, is actually able to directly interact with the technician or the manufacturer, and the device gets to you, but you don't really have to go back to the technician or the physician to figure how to make it work for you. That can be done through, we talked about APIs, apps, other technologies. And imagine in particular that not only can you now build this nonlinear system of creating value, but at various points in this architecture, the end customer actually has choice about which partners they wish to employ in this value chain, right? So rather than the system, the hospital choosing the physician or the technician or maybe an app inside that, imagine if you had the same power you have when you choose which PDF writer or mail app you want on your phone, right? So what we want to think about is in terms of a framework of using platform thinking, API technologies, apps, and so forth, to create a business architecture in which customers can create on-demand configurable supply chains, right? Supply chains are usually built by the supply side. But imagine a world in which customers could actually configure supply chains on demand. And so the framework is really to think about how you can provide all these services and more value while creating customer choice, giving them convenience, because you don't have to go and interact with all these players at different locations. The data flow manages everything for you. And it's all done at a cost which is no more than the cost of building a hardwired long-term contract-based supply chain, right? So that's where I would like to stop. If there are a couple of minutes for questions, I'm happy to take them. But otherwise, I would love to interact with you during the rest of the day.